Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree is a part of the Public Square Media network of podcasts that seek to bring an LDS perspective into the public square. I'm your host, Carl Cranney. I have a PhD in religion, and I like to write on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture. And joining me today is, of course, my co-host, Liz.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Busby. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy and a reviewer of books and a Latter-day Saint.
And our two guests today are Adam and Rachel. Adam, could you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Yep, I am a Latin teacher and archival librarian who lives in New Jersey. I'm also an author and writer. I've written several books on the Old Testament and also some books on ancient American civilization and published several articles on Mormon theology and Mormon scripture. Great to be here.
And Adam and I met back in our master's program back in the day when he was a Baptist.
Yes,
so he is
20 years ago. So
Yep. He made the jump to Mormonism since then, and we're excited to have him aboard.
Yes.
Yeah. And Rachel, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm the Wikipedian in residence at the BOE Library. I know that sounds kind of made up, but I assure you it's real. I also write interactive fiction, and I'm really into Mormon literary criticism, Mormon literature, and like to promote Mormons doing and writing those things.
Glad to have you. Today, we're going to be comparing two recent Pinocchio films. The first is Disney's live-action remake of their animated classic, which is available in Disney Plus and came out in September. The second is Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, which is available on Netflix and came out in December. They both came out really close in proximity to each other, so we're interested to see who did the better job with this classic story. But first, we're going to do our Best Books segment, where we each recommend one thing that we are watching, reading, or listening to. A few episodes ago, I recommended Star Wars Tales of the Jedi from Disney Plus, and I'd like to plug a sister show from Disney Plus called Star Wars Visions. It's just a bunch of random short stories, not really related to each other, but they're all done in anime style, and I think Star Wars really lends itself to the Japanese culture and like Akira Kurosawa films and anime. And so it's just really quite delightful. They're all short, 15 to 20 minutes long each, and are just a fun little thing to watch sometimes when you have a few minutes to spare and are interested in either Japan or anime or Star Wars, or in some cases, all three. And then the other one I just like to plug, not that I've been watching it recently, but that some of the Pinocchio stuff that we watched reminded me of, is The Fountain by Darren Aronofsky. One of our earlier episodes was on Darren Aronofsky's Noah. This is a filmmaker who is always swinging for the fences, and The Fountain is a wonderful meditation on death and dying and the nature of human life and whether it should be eternal or not, and just all sorts of interesting stuff. It's a very weird movie and didn't get a lot of attention when it came out, because it was, but it's grown on lots of people, myself included. Star Wars Visions from Disney Plus and The Fountain by Darren Aronofsky are both the things that I would like to plug today. Liz, what have you got for us this time?
I have been reading for my local book club Beauty by Robin McKinley. It's a 1970s, I believe, retelling of Beauty and the Beast. It's a classic of that fairy tale retelling genre before all the modern ones came out. It's got just really beautiful language and really fleshes out the Beauty and the Beast story. And I thought it went well with the Pinocchio retellings we're doing today, being that it's a retelling in its own right. Just a really nice version of Beauty and the Beast. Highly recommended.
All right. Thank you. And Rachel, what have you got to plug for us today?
So, Book Talk recommended this book called The Office of Historical Corrections to me. It's by Danielle Evans. And it's short stories and a novella about, most of it's like realist literary fiction, but the eponymous novella, it's set in an alternate future where there was this office created to correct information for the public. And as someone who's often correcting Wikipedia pages, it really was like, oh, this is like my job. Except, of course, the characters in the book are going onto monuments and they have these little printers and issuing corrections. And It's like a lot more dramatic and personal. But of course, that isn't the only thing going on. My kind of fiction, there's always another thing going on. And there's some drama she has with a correction that her former coworker issued, and it's just my kind of nerdery. And I also wanted to plug Wayfair magazine. I was like, oh, I mentioned that I'm into Mormon literary criticism, and I wanted to mention it too. There's a lot of interesting essays in here, and I might be referencing it later in our podcast.
I've really been enjoying Wayfair as well. Like, I've been reading through the stuff and just really interesting essays going on there. There's something different than you're used to reading.
And Adam, what do you have to plug for us today?
So with two little kids, I don't get too much time to actually read hardback books, but I do listen to books all the time on Audible. It doesn't stop me from buying books. I just bought a book, Racing the Priesthood by W. Paul Reeve. But a book that I've been listening to on Audible that I highly recommend is The Lost City of Z by David Grann. They made a movie about it with the dude from Sons of Anarchy a couple years back, but it's about basically Percy Follett and his search for the city of gold, El Dorado, in South America. And it's really interesting. It's something I'm personally interested in. I'm really into ancient American history, both South American history and North American history. So I was really excited about it. And it reads like an adventure novel, just H. Rider Haggard, King Solomon's Mines, or something like that. But it's all real. So it's talking about Percy Fawcett and basically giving his background. And then the author himself, he must have had bukus of money because he does his own expedition to try to find Percy Fawcett, which I think is publicity stunt, but it's cool nonetheless. So highly recommended. Also watching Star Trek Picard. Like I was telling you guys earlier, I was disappointed with the second season, the past season, but this season has all the characters from the Next Generation. So I'm really excited about that. Full of nostalgia, almost made me cry seeing all of them. Really looking forward to this season and hope that it will correct some of the previous season.
We will have links to all these recommendations on our website, popcultureapricottree.com. Buying through these links would help support our podcast so we can keep bringing you conversations about the true and beautiful in pop culture. We also want to shout out a recent episode from one of our fellow Public Square Media podcasts. I wanted to highlight a series from the Family Bro Evening podcast, where the hosts JC and Scott discuss LDS culture and beliefs. Their tagline is, "We want to discuss our core doctrines, wade through the murky waters of culture, ask the hard questions about church history, and just have a little bit of fun." And they had more than a little bit of fun. One of their recent series was one where they review an old LDS fireside from the early 80s that's chock full of satanic panic nonsense. Things like Dungeons and Dragons is going to teach you real witchcraft, and Hotel California by the Eagles is actually a prayer to Satan. Apparently, it's a talk that was passed around both of their missions as some kind of deep doctrine that greenies wouldn't be ready for, but it really ends up being just a bunch of nonsense, and they do a pretty good job of breaking it down where it needs to be broken down and mocking it thoroughly when it deserves to be mocked, which is about 98% of it. I hope it helps us be more discerning in where we get our information and how to verify information when it comes across our plate, even if it's coming from a supposedly reputable source like a brother invited to give a fireside by your local church leaders. It's episodes 48, 49, then 51 and 52 of Family Bro Evening. They listen to it, so you get the audio of the fireside itself, and then they pause it to give their commentary on it. And it was just a really fun way to spend a couple of hours listening to them go over this old fireside. So I recommend those episodes of Family Bro Evening for your listening pleasures. And now on to our main discussion of Pinocchio, or I should say of the Pinocchios. Just want to get everybody's sort of general thoughts before we get started into some of the nitty-gritty. I myself was quite disappointed in the Disney Plus version. I felt like it was mostly just a cash grab. Hey, let's just throw Tom Hanks in as Geppetto and then people will watch this and it'll be great. And it wasn't. And the Del Toro one is very weird. But if you've watched anything by Del Toro, you knew what he was when you picked him up. And there's always something to say, and there's some interesting things there. But they all hit, like Liz was talking about in our last episode about The Chosen, they hit the right beats, they hit all the same plot points, but they remix them in such interesting ways that there's some good things to be drawn from both. I did watch the Disney Plus one with my kids, and we had some good conversations after, so I don't want to come across as thinking it's a complete waste of your time, but Anyway, those are some of my thoughts. I'd be curious what other people thought, just on a broad level, before we get into some of the specifics, what you thought of these two renditions of the Pinocchio story. Liz, how about you go first?
I'm basically the same as you. I watched the Disney Plus one with my kids, and they enjoyed it, having not seen the original animated one that it's based on. And I felt pretty sad watching it, given that I've seen the animated one that it's based on, and it just felt like a poor, cheap copy. Like, Cinderella is one of the few live action remakes that added to the story, and I felt like this one really doesn't add to the story. It just cash grabs a bit on the nostalgia of the parents. I love the Guillermo del Toro one. It was very interesting. I'm super into that stop motion animation stuff. And so is my husband. I watched it with him. Did not watch that one with the kids because I wasn't sure they'd be able to handle it. And probably the best choice. Not really a young children's movie in the same way.
Rachel, what are some of your overall thoughts on these two?
So, yeah, similarly, I was like, the Disney Plus version, it's so disappointing that they had this opportunity to do more with it. Although I could not look away from the animation of some of the characters. It was so lifelike, especially the fox and the cat character. Their animation was really amazing to me, and I could tell a lot of skill went into it. But at the same time, I found their version of Pinocchio to be uncanny. They chose to use exactly the same character design as the original, and I'm like, oh, this is because it's the iconic thing, and they need that for their thumbnail so that people know exactly what it is when they see it. And I don't know, so many parts of it were just so calculated to be that cash grab that it's like, what? And I didn't know it was Tom Hanks before I started watching it. I'm like, oh, they found some nice little guy to be Geppetto. And then like his own speaking style comes in, and it's, oh my gosh, this is, wait, is that Tom Hanks? And I was like, this is completely distracting. And like, towards the end, in the boat scene, he just completely stops trying to do the Italian accent. And it's like, why are we playing the Tom Hanks character for laughs? It's just laughing at itself in a weird way. But the Del Toro...
Well, can I interrupt real quick?
Go ahead.
I thought I did not like the animation on the animal characters. I felt like they were pre-correction Sonic the Hedgehog, uncanny. Like, we turned this animated character into a realistic looking animal, and it's weird. And we needed to go about 10% more towards the cartoon, and then it would have been comfortable. Like, I kept staring at Jiminy Cricket the whole time, being like, this just feels wrong.
Oh yeah, excuse me for bringing up a crass thing, but the feet on Jiminy Cricket, I'm like, why don't they look more like a bug's feet? Why did they actually have toes? Like, I don't know why my brain just picked up on that. I was like, this doesn't look right. But that's true to the original, which
Yeah.
I don't know. But the Del Toro one is like so fantastic, but also, I don't know if you've noticed in Miyazaki's films, he's got this persistent theme of anti-war, and it's almost like an obsession with him, and the stories keep coming back to it, almost to the point where I'm like, I just wanted to have an escape, and you keep telling me about how terrible war is. And of course, war is terrible, and artists are allowed to talk about that. And I guess that's how I felt about the Del Toro preoccupation with war. I'm like, I don't want to think about it, but we should think about it. And by tying it to a real part of Italian history, he makes it so we can't just completely divorce this story from real life. Fairy tales are usually so divorced from real life that we can be like, oh, it's an allegory. But when we mash it up with things that happened in real history, it's harder to divorce ourselves from it and be like, this is like a lesson we can apply to our... Maybe it's not harder. I don't know.
I did think it was weird. Mussolini shows up halfway through the film, and you're like, oh, okay. I was not expecting fascist dictator in my Pinocchio rendition. Okay, cool.
And he executes people. Yeah. It's kind of crazy.
Adam, what were some of your overall thoughts on these two movies?
So I had deep thoughts about this, Carl, because Pinocchio is in my trinity of Disney movies with Hercules and Snow White. So I super love Pinocchio. So to some extent, the Disney one, because it does nothing different at all, I was actually happy about that. So if it's not broke, don't fix it. I did think Pinocchio looked extremely fake. I thought the fox and the cat looked, like Rachel said, I actually thought they looked really good CGI, but that Pinocchio himself looked like something that my 9-year-old does on his coding system on his computer.
I want to talk about that real quick, just interestingly. I wonder if it's like they did the photorealistic animals from their remake of The Lion King for those two, but because they had to stick with the traditional Pinocchio, that's why we had this weird juxtaposition of these different characters that looked so good or so realistic, at least according to Rachel, and I'm in that camp. And then for Liz, it's, no, the uncanny valley. But then the Pinocchio was so weird. It's like they made two different choices artistically there, and that made the juxtaposition of those choices very jarring.
Come on, Disney, you can do better. If you can de-age Harrison Ford and you can create a CGI Tarkin that looks real in Rogue One, you could do better with Pinocchio. But overall, my favorite live action for Disney was Beauty and the Beast. It went some different ways, and I love that. But because Pinocchio is such a beloved film for myself, I was not really upset that it didn't change anything. Now, with the Del Toro film, I'm a big fan of Del Toro, but this movie bothered me a lot. I thought it was really dark. It had fascists in it. I'm like, why are fascists in a Pinocchio film? And it felt like Pan's Labyrinth Part 2. Now, with that said, my son, I watched the Disney live action with my younger son, my 6-year-old, and he absolutely loved it. I watched the Del Toro one with my older son, my 9-year-old, and he absolutely loved that. I make my kids suffer through the animated Disney Pinocchio at least a couple times a year. So he actually liked the Del Toro one a lot better. But I just think that's the phase that he's at right now, where he likes those kind of dark animated movies like Coraline and stuff like that.
Coraline is a good comparison.
Yeah, I like that. I love that most parents, their kids make them watch Disney movies hundreds of times a year. You're like, nope, I'm going to flip that on its head. I'm going to make you watch the ones that I grew up with. I love it. I think it's interesting that so many of us reacted so interestingly to the real world application, because even in both of them, it's obviously a small town in Italy and everybody's got Italian names, and it's obviously somewhere that's not completely divorced, but then sticking it right in the middle of World War II changes the way we look at Pinocchio and its application to us as watchers of fiction.
Liz was saying that it was interesting to read about the original Pinocchio. I didn't have time to read up on it, so maybe you could give me, because I think it's not like a fairy tale. Like someone actually wrote the story of Pinocchio, right?
I believe it was in the 1800s that it was first written, like when Italy is starting to industrialize. And so Pinocchio is a representative of the poor country people coming into the city and being totally ignorant and not knowing what's going on. So it's kind of a fool story. The original Pinocchio, he is not innocent and cute and like naive. He is a jerk. He comes to life and the first thing he does is like insult his father and slap him in the face. So like he is not a lovable character. And apparently the original Disney film, they started with him like that. And they're like, this is not working at all.
Especially because in the Del Toro version, he starts out like very selfish.
Yeah, he's selfish, but he's not a jerk. There's a difference between the two. It was interesting though, seeing like how many times it's been adapted since then. It really has become a fairy tale, or at least a folk tale. I don't know precisely the difference between those two we could argue about, but it's been adapted a lot of times. I didn't realize it's very popular in the Soviet Union. Apparently, in the early 1900s, this Russian sci-fi writer made a Russian version of Pinocchio, and that was made into several films over the course of the life of the Soviet Union. So it's very popular over there too. And there are lots of modern films that are based on it, like AI, artificial intelligence, Astro Boy from Japan owe a lot to this Pinocchio story about a boy who's not real and who's created, who wants to become real, and this looking at what humanity is. So I thought that was fascinating. I would love to compare all of those.
Yeah, the AI one, which was one of my recommendations earlier this year in the Black Mirror episode, or Data from Star Trek, to go back to your recommendation, Adam, right? He is this artificial being who wants to be more human. Pinocchio was maybe one of the first to really delve into that, and it shows up here in some interesting ways. And that was an interesting point, that neither of these movies ends with Pinocchio. Well, okay, in the Disney Plus version, as he's walking away, if you're paying attention, his leg starts to change from the wooden one with the joints to a real flesh and blood one. But then 3 seconds later, it fades to credits, and that's all you get.
Yeah, I wasn't even sure if I'd seen that. I was like, did that just happen? I'm not sure if it did happen. Like, it's almost deniable that it happened at all.
which is part of, I think, the choice that they made, which is an interesting one. The Del Toro one, he never turns into a real boy. The one spirit says to him, you will become a real boy if you go back this time, but you will die. And he says, okay, sign me up. I want to go save my dad right now. But he doesn't come back as a flesh and blood boy. He comes back as himself. And apparently he's mortal now. That's never shown because everybody else dies and he wanders off into the world, and that's the end of the movie. So neither one of them had this key part of the story, which is that he eventually becomes a human.
Okay, well, that's not in the original. It's in the Disney original. But like the original story with the obnoxious Pinocchio ends up with the townspeople hang him. And he dies. So not a happy ending. But typically, yes, they do end that way.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I read the essay in Wayfair. There's an essay by Michael Ferguson on spiritual matter, Joseph Smith's hylomorphic theology, which is basically, okay, if we actually believe that spirit is matter, what does that mean? And so instead of having this spirit and body dualism, where there's some kind of gestalt kind of thing that's more, if you exercise and do weightlifting, your muscles will get stronger. And like the things we do spiritually can also affect our spirits. And this is like at the core of the original Disney animated feature where he lies and his nose grows. Like he does something spiritually, morally, and it affects his body. And like when he goes to Pleasure Island, he starts turning into a donkey. Like his physical body is changing. So therefore it makes sense at the end where he's undergone a spiritual transformation and it shows up in his body. And so for both of the films I'm taking the Disney Plus ending to be that he doesn't physically transform. And also in Del Toro's, the boy remains made of wood. And so for them both to not transform, are they just saying, oh, it's what's inside that counts? But like in the Disney Plus version, he does transform on Pleasure Island. So it doesn't make sense to me to just change that part. The whole thing about Pinocchio is that his body is affected by what he thinks and feels and does. And to make it so he doesn't transform at the end, it's like, why would you do that? It doesn't make sense internally anymore. But I'm one of those people who's, I want it to all circle back and make sense. So maybe this is showing an acceptance of the spiritual versus physical dichotomy.
Disability theory would say that you don't want to say that your body gets fixed when you're a good person. Like, that's a problematic statement.
I think they're also trying to correct itself because in so many of its previous fairy tales, so look at my wife's favorite Disney movie, The Little Mermaid. All her whole being is about being the other, being different. And then she finally gets her wish. And what kind of message is that? You always have to be something else. I think Disney's trying to correct that and say, no, it's okay to be who you are. So I think at least with the live action Disney one, that might have been a corrective from some of these previous fairy tales where the person's always trying to be, where they think that their wholeness, their completeness is being something completely different than themselves.
From a theological angle, I think that in Mormonism, we do believe that our bodies will change in the resurrection and our soul is the spirit and the body. And so a Pinocchio adaptation where Pinocchio does transform in the end, it's more of a transhumanist kind of thing, right? The idea that like, if we just could figure this out, we could be uber humans. I say that in a silly way, but do we actually believe that?
In Mormon theology, if I'm getting it right, in my humble opinion, yes, we will be a finer physical version of ourselves, a better form of ourselves, but we'll be the same. You, Carl, Liz, and me will be chilling in the celestial kingdom all the same, but our bodies will be a better type of body than they are now.
I like that because 2 points. One, it's interesting. We don't talk about this a lot in Latter-day Saint theology, but it's right there in 1 Corinthians when we quote 1 Corinthians 15, like 30 through 34 or whatever, to talk about the 3 degrees of glory. We forget that 1 Corinthians 15, the entire chapter is about the resurrection. When it says there are bodies celestial and bodies terrestrial, you'll be resurrected differently if you go to a different kingdom. That's what it's saying. And then we use it to talk about the sort of tripartite heaven, and we kind of ignore the differences among the different. I think I just blew Rachel's mind for those of you who are watching on YouTube. It's something that we don't talk about very much, and we don't integrate it into the theology of the three kingdoms as much as I think Paul and other scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants as well would have us.
I wanted to point out that I think Brandon Sanderson handles this really well in the Stormlight Archive, right? He talks a lot about how the difference between our conception of ourselves and our physical selves. There's this character of Kaladin who doesn't forgive himself. When you receive the magic system, your body gets healed. Like one of the members of Bridge 4 doesn't have an arm, and when he acquires magical powers, his arm grows back because that's how he sees himself. He doesn't see the loss of his arm as part of himself. But Kaladin has these slave brands on his forehead, and because that identity of I am a slave, I am a terrible person, I always lose, is part of him, that doesn't get healed until later when he's finally able to forgive himself, then those go away. So I like that he dealt with that idea of how does our conception of ourselves affect how our bodies are when they are perfected? And that can go with this. Is Pinocchio's conception of himself as a wooden boy still is fine? Or is it that he wants to be a real boy because that's what his conception of himself is?
I think with both of the movies, I think this has always been part of the Pinocchio mythos, it's not so much that he wants to be a real flesh and blood boy, but he wants to be a real son to Geppetto. And what does that look like? He can stay the same, but as long as Geppetto accepts him as his real son, as a real boy, his physical appearance doesn't really matter. I think Del Toro, I had problems with Del Toro movie. I think that's something that he hit on the head very powerfully.
That parental relationship is bigger here in both of these movies than in the original Disney one, I think.
Absolutely. My second thought I was going to point out was, are both of these then, by having him not explicitly changed to be flesh and blood, leaning into what we talked about in our very first episode, talking about Encanto and expressive individualism, this idea that you're fine as is and you don't need to, I'm overstating the point, correct anything in yourself, like, the only shackles you have are what you put on yourself. Nobody else should impose those on you. It's just a matter of discovering who you are and letting that shine forth. As opposed to the Pinocchio general thought is that you change and try to do something better. You start off like waking up and slapping your father in the face, or just being generally rude and ignorant to him in both of these versions of it. And then becoming a better moral person, understanding what it means to be a good son, what it means to have your father's love. Everybody loves their children, but children can act in ways that are disappointing, and you don't stop loving them. But the child, and this is true for all of us, like God will always love us, but our actions will have consequences, and his love for us doesn't change. But if we choose not to accept the gospel, eventually that's going to have long-term consequences for us. And so there's this interesting interplay between what Geppetto expects of him and what Pinocchio wants for himself. Growing up and moving out of the house was a much bigger theme in the Del Toro version than the Disney Plus version. But there's some interesting things to say about the interplay between what are your responsibilities as a parent to raise a child, to have them be good, and then at the same time, right, it's right there in Genesis chapter 1, man should leave his father and mother, and he has to leave them and become his own person. And so, I don't know, there were some interesting interplays there with expressive individualism thrown in.
I really liked Geppetto in the Guillermo del Toro one a lot better than the Disney one. The Disney one felt like a kid's version of what a parent is, that Geppetto like unconditionally loves Pinocchio, and he's just always kindly and wants Pinocchio to be happy, and he's never frustrated. Whereas Geppetto in the Guillermo del Toro one feels like me, like as a parent, like I have definitely, you lash out at your kids when they're doing something real stupid, and you're just like, why? Why are you doing this? Why don't you get this? Why can't you understand how what you're doing affects me? And he regrets that later. And his search for Pinocchio feels so much more real because he's trying to repent of what he did to Pinocchio in lashing out at him. I screwed this up. I really want to fix this. Whereas the other one's, well, I'm just going to follow Pinocchio because that's what dads do.
I think with Disney tried to completely replicate the animated Pinocchio for the live action one. A lot of the spirit of Geppetto, it was like he was like a Star Wars clone. There wasn't a whole lot of personality to him, which is a lot saying that, it's played by Tom Hanks, who I think is one of the best actors out there.
If Tom Hanks is acting like a wooden plank, they didn't give him a lot to work with.
On the theme of the Del Toro version having a little more like gritty realism in their relationships, what did you guys think of the darker aspects of it? Especially the way that the puppet master has an abusive relationship with Pinocchio and his monkey, and like the way the monkey is seeing how Pinocchio is falling into the same trap that he's in. It is a bit heartbreaking, the position this really intelligent monkey is in, and how the monkey is trying to console Pinocchio through the other puppets. And it seems to me the more realistic depiction of abuse. And I was thinking about it, would this be too heavy for a child to view? But children do deal with abuse, and also sometimes they do like that kind of dark stuff. So what was your opinion on that?
I really liked that gave it some weight. There was some gravitas because they were dealing with this character who is clearly both emotionally abusive and physically abusive. Like he cuts the tip of Pinocchio's nose off with his sword at one point. And then to see Pinocchio overcome that and see the other abuse victim in this monkey and try to save him. And in that moment where Pinocchio is literally up on the wooden plank like Jesus, like the cross, he's clearly becoming a Christ figure in his overcoming his initial selfishness and becoming selfless to help his father and to go back and repair the damage he did in the relationship as well, to help the monkey out, all overcoming the circumstances in which he has found himself and in which he had placed himself in this rendition of the story.
Did you guys catch when Count Volpe does the literal temptation of Christ moment? I will give you all the kingdoms of the earth, just work for me. Oh, okay. There's some really deep Christianity in this one.
Which is interesting because the spirits are all accurate angels with all the eyes on the wings and stuff like that.
The Blue Fairy's wood sprite character is definitely 3 pairs of wings with eyes. It's very much inspired by that biblical description.
There's a lot of Christian elements in it. Like even at the beginning when Geppetto's with his own son, with his flesh and blood son, and they're in the church and everything. So yeah.
And the fact that he was carving the crucifix for the church, and then in his despair, he didn't finish it for so long because he was working on the doll that becomes Pinocchio.
And also Pinocchio asking, everybody loves this wooden Christ you've made. Why don't any of them like me? He's explicitly in the movie comparing himself to Christ, and he has this same ability to lay down his life and take it back up again in that he's an immortal puppet.
And I think for me, like Pinocchio's decision in the Del Toro version to become mortal, to save his father, it was really touching to me. I know I'm like, it's just a cartoon, Rachel, but it gave me like another sort of like point of view on Jesus, which I'm like, we've been studying Jesus how long, and I hadn't thought about like Jesus making the decision, oh, I'll be mortal and save the people I love. But it's more personal with Pinocchio because you've seen the relationship between him and Geppetto the whole time. And in the beginning, his dad is disappointed with him. But to see it develop and grow, it gives us more attachment to it. And to see that Pinocchio has reached this level of humanness, that he's willing to die for his father, I found it touching.
It reminded me a little bit of the story of the parents who had a child who needed a bone marrow transplant. And so they had another child in the hopes that the second child would be a match for their first. And that whole thing comes to, I see the look on your face, Rachel. You're like, what is happening? And this whole discussion about what obligation we have to our children, which I mentioned previously, because they barely hit on this in the Disney Plus version. You're like, oh, he lost a son previously. Yeah. And they show the picture for a minute. And that's part of why he's creating this Pinocchio doll. And then it gets dropped and it never gets mentioned again. But in the Del Toro one, you spend the first 20 minutes of the movie with the son who then is killed in the bombing raid in the church. And you see that the father really wants Pinocchio to be a new version of Carlos and the expectations he places on him instead of letting him be his own person.
It's definitely something we're guilty of as parents too. Like we have expectations of our kids, and they come as themselves. There are definitely times when I'm like, I want you to be this way, but you just are not that way. And I have to work with what I have. My father-in-law works in the marriage and family department at BYU. But the thing he always tells us is they come with 50% genetic predispositions and the way they are, like 25% is their own agency, and you as a parent have 25% left, and that's what you can influence. And you cannot push them to be completely different than they are, because they are who they are. We have that ability to mold, and they have that ability to make choices, but we do have some things that we come with, and we're not someone else.
Anybody who thinks the tabula rasa version of human babies has obviously never been a parent. They are not blank slates that you get to write your... Nope, that's not how it works.
I've tried. I've wanted my son to learn Latin because I'm a Latin teacher. Didn't work at all. I bribed him. I said, I will give you $1 for every sentence of Latin you translate from the Latin Vulgate. And he wouldn't do it. Didn't happen. Carl and Liz, you hit on the head. They are their own person. We can't make them into what we want them to be.
But it's fun to see Pinocchio understand the reason my father is asking me to do when he comes to understand that, he begins to make more correct decisions about wanting to go to school and do things to please his father, not just to please his father, not just because dad wants me to, but because dad is asking me to do something that will be beneficial to me. And I now see that. Yeah,
the message isn't, my parents had expectations for me and they are wrong, which would be the expressive individualism message, that anyone's expectations do not apply to me. I am who I am. It goes back to this relationship. Like, he realizes that he is in a relationship with his father, and that relationship comes with responsibilities, and he needs to change how he acts towards his father, not because his father expects certain things of him, but because he cares about his father and his father cares about him.
That's a good model for how kind of our relationship with Heavenly Father from a theological perspective.
Right. If we're looking at the commandments as if I need to hold myself to this standard, and if I don't, I'm a failure, that's not the goal. The goal is Heavenly Father is trying to help us grow because he cares about us and wants us to reach our potential. And so we're working with him in relationship with him instead of, here's this standard, meet this standard, be a robot.
Stormtroopers for Jesus is not the goal of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
No.
What did you guys think of the existential horror angle of Pinocchio when the divine sphinx or whatever is talking to Pinocchio about his status as an eternal being? And she says, eternal life can bring eternal suffering. And so that was giving me chills as a Mormon, right? We think about eternal life and we're like, if you have the word eternal, it's the good stuff. But at the same time, it has the potential to be miserable.
I have a friend who is terrified of living forever, and he considers himself kind of culturally Mormon, but the idea of actually existing as a conscious being for the rest of everything just terrifies him. And yeah, so there was a very Buddhist ending to the Del Toro film, because Geppetto dies, and then Sebastian dies, and then the monkey dies, and they all die, and then Pinocchio goes off. But it talks about how their relationship brought both a lot of suffering, because they treated each other very poorly, and they had to work on that. But then eventually it grew into this wonderful thing. But then it stopped, because Geppetto got old and passed away. And that's true of all the other characters. And it implies that Pinocchio is going to die at some point, because the biblically correct angel sphinx person said he was going to, but it doesn't ever happen on screen. There's something very Buddhist about that. That's why I mentioned the fountain in my recommendations, because one of the names of the songs from the soundtrack is Death is the Road to Awe. Yeah. And the fountain really leans into this idea that if we all lived forever, we would not be human in the same way anymore. And like, we need the idea that we are going to die to be fully human.
You know, this brings back memories of our Yale years, Carl, and those courses we took with Dr. Wolf on Karl Barth and Karl Rahner. And you remember that Barth, he doesn't really talk about eternal life after death. He says that eternal life consists of being in a relationship with that which is eternal, namely God the Father. There's no, for him, afterlife.
Your life becomes an eternal DVD in the mind of God.
Yes. Yeah.
Like that. There's no continuation of your existence afterwards.
God has a relationship with you, and that God is eternal. Therefore, God has memory of that relationship for eternity.
I didn't get that from Miroslav Volf so much as I did from Serene Jones. And I remember that day in her class because everybody revolted against that version of art. And she was like, I don't understand why you're all pushing back so much against this. And I almost wanted to raise my head and say, because you finally said something that is so far outside the bounds of normal Christianity that even the liberal Protestants are pushing back against you.
Going back to that line about eternal life can bring eternal suffering, that was a really good line. And then also at the end where Geppetto says that Pinocchio brought him terrible joy, just this idea of how connected love is to suffering, and that because we become attached to something, it will also bring us pain. It reminded me a lot of 2 Nephi 2, right? You can't have joy without knowing misery. And so in the Disney version, it felt like Geppetto's only feeling joy towards Pinocchio. There's no suffering, and that's why the relationship feels so hollow. But in the Guillermo del Toro one, there is pain in that relationship. There is suffering brought on by each other, and there's also great joy because of that. And the joy is so much higher because the relationship feels real. Yeah.
It also reminds me of the Pearl of Great Price. I think it's Moses 7 or Moses 6. They taste the bitter in order that they may prize the good. Very similar type of understanding there. If you prize something, you're also going to have to go through some bitterness with it.
All right. Were there any thoughts anybody wanted to get on the table?
Yeah, we could talk more about the Pleasure Island, where in the Disney Plus version, Pinocchio doesn't really do anything bad.
Drink some root beer. Must have been caffeinated root beer. That was his problem right there.
Pleasure Island looks like Disney World, I like to say, by the way.
Oh, yeah. There are definitely several reviews that pointed out that this looks like Disneyland and it's the bad place.
But like in the original animated version, Pinocchio, he's like smoking a cigar and
actual alcohol.
They scratch up the pool table. Like, I remember being uncomfortable with that destruction as a child. But then, like, also in the Del Toro version, their Pleasure Island is a war.
The Hunger Games miniature game.
They're trying to make children into little soldiers. And also, Pinocchio is like completely innocent of doing anything bad there. Do you think it takes away from the story of Pinocchio to have him be so good?
Yeah, he doesn't really make any huge mistakes other than not going to school and being swayed by fame. That does happen in both of them, but in Pleasure Island, he is immediately uncomfortable with it, which could be kind of an internal conscience thing, which is where they're leaning, that he's trying to develop a conscience and he can feel that it's wrong from the beginning and doesn't really do anything. But then why does he get punished for it? It seems like it's more of a drug thing. Oh, the root beer must be drugged, so everybody turns into a donkey. It has nothing to do with anything you did.
Which goes back to our conversation about how what you do spiritually, does it affect you physically? Should it in every instance in Pinocchio or not? This is a thought that I just barely had. The juxtaposing the Pleasure Island, we don't need parents. We don't need their rules. We're just like all the kids are singing that song with the Luke Evans characters. They're on their way to Pleasure Island. And then in the Del Toro version, what you do have is a very involved parent. With the guy who's trying to turn them into a bunch of fascists and they're all marching around and saluting and he's trying to, and then when they work together to achieve the objective at the end, he's, nope, you did that wrong. Now shoot your friend. That's an interesting juxtaposition between we don't want any parents versus a parent who was too involved but only wants you to be this one thing. And we see that sort of heartbreaking. I feel bad that we left that kid behind in the Del Toro version. You see him escape from the camp as the bombs are falling, but then he disappears and you never see him again. You don't know what his fate was or what happened to his dad, or did he ever become a better person or decide to finally...
Does he go work for the Red Cross or something?
Like the original concern that there's some moralizing about in Pinocchio is the original, which I call the Pleasure Island to prison pipeline, where they're like, oh, if you neglect your children, they will become criminals. And story not just on the level up to children, but also to their parents. But then with the Del Toro version, it matches some modern concerns we have with parenting. Oh, we're too involved and our own morals are bad and we're teaching them to children. So I don't know if the Del Toro version really works like that. But it's interesting how he changed it. And I think it reflects our more modern concerns about parents being way too involved and not letting their own children's morality grow.
Good parenting is somewhere between abandon them to Pleasure Island and Disney World versus
Military boot camp.
reality is somewhere in between those two extremes, I would hope.
And going back to Liz's point, I think Geppetto in Del Toro's kind of embodies like your typical parent. He's much more relatable in that regard than, again, comparing him to Tom Hanks in the Disney live action one.
Let's finish with our ratings segment. We have 3 different ratings to judge each of these different renditions of Pinocchio on. Our first is the content, clean versus objectionable material. And we rate things celestial, terrestrial, telestial, or outer darkness. And I'm very curious to see how this goes with the Del Toro one. I don't think there was very much objectionable content in the Disney Plus one. I think I would give that a celestial rating myself, but I'm curious to see what you all think. Rachel, why don't you go first?
I guess I need terrestrial because I feel like while there were these really dark scenes of abuse, they were very careful to like cut away before showing very much actual domestic violence. Does that make it better? Or maybe it makes it worse because it's all happening in your head and what you imagine can be even worse. What is shown that it matters to me, it's also if this depiction is going to help children to process this kind of stuff. And I think it would. So that's why I would say terrestrial rather than telestial. And also, it's rated PG. So,
Are you talking about the Disney one or the Guillermo del Toro one?
The Del Toro one, yeah, terrestrial. Yeah, celestial for the Disney Plus one. It seems pretty squeaky clean.
Adam, how would you rate these 2 different versions of Pinocchio?
I'd say terrestrial for Disney. So the reason I give middle rating for Disney is because it was such a clone copy of the original Pinocchio. It didn't really point towards the Mormon idea of exaltation. It didn't really go above and beyond anything. For the Del Toro one, I would say outer darkness. We have kids getting run over by cars, blown up with grenades, blown up time and time again. That's kind of rough to me. Like I said, my 9-year-old, he loved it. He loved all the dark stuff, but definitely outer darkness and not coming anywhere near the 3 kingdoms. Yeah.
Liz, what did you think of them?
I'm going to say I think the Disney one in terms of just content is celestial. It's pretty unscary. My 6-year-old watched it with me. She's pretty sensitive. There were a few moments where she was a little nervous, but it wasn't terribly frightening in any point. They're quick to get over things. I'm going to split the difference and put Guillermo del Toro in telestial. I think it pretty well reflects the world in which we now live. It's very much, here's war, here's abuse, here's all these things. And so you would need to know if your child can handle that. It definitely is a little more disturbing than the Disney version.
Yeah. So I gave Disney Celestial just because it's so relatively squeaky clean. I think the world in which we now live, absolutely. That's a good way of rating the Del Toro one, Telestial. There's some stuff there. Although I don't think the Del Toro one is a kids movie. Like we keep saying this for our kids, like this is good for adults to watch. It's a good movie. Del Toro has interesting things to say. Just because it's stop motion animation doesn't mean it's for kids. You would not watch South Park with your kids. Just because it's animated doesn't mean it's for children. So that's something to keep in mind as well. The next metric that we rate stories on is artistic merit, skillful, effective use of craft. We do a rating of 1 to 5 popcorn balls, and I'll let you lead this one off, Liz. What do you think? 1 to 5 popcorn balls, the Disney Plus and the Del Toro version.
I think I have to give the Del Toro version 5 popcorn balls. I think he has a clear artistic vision. He does some clever and creative things with a story that we thought we all knew. The dialogue is good. The symbolism is good. Overall, it's a well-crafted movie. There's a reason it's nominated for an Oscar. It deserves it. The Disney one, I feel like it doesn't quite do either the full nostalgia track where let's just remake this shot for shot because it's a great movie and we need an updated version for some reason. And it also doesn't really transform it. So I don't know if I can give it higher than a 2 in terms of artistic merit for me. I just don't think it really adds a lot in terms of a movie. I would rather go back and watch the animated Disney one personally.
I would agree with that. I kind of want to watch the animated one with my kids now and get their thoughts on which one was better. Adam, what did you think? Artistic merit, 1 to 5 popcorn balls.
Artistically, like most of Del Toro's movies, 5 out of 5. It was beautifully dark, very much like Tim Burton type of beauty, type of design there.
Beautifully dark is a great way to describe most of Del Toro's work.
Yes, he didn't disappoint in that one. The Disney one, I'm going to go with Liz, 3 or 2, because, come on, this is Disney now. And like I said, some of the special effects looked really bad. Now, the fox, like I said, looked really good. As Rachel pointed out, the fox looked really good. But that Pinocchio and that whale at the end, we could do better than that. Yeah, they just rushed it.
Sometimes even like this CGI, when someone's holding Pinocchio, it really doesn't look like they're holding anything. Like you can tell that like they were holding something and then the animation is off and it just doesn't work. Like bad effects in a Disney movie is inexcusable. You have so much budget.
If you own the whole entire world, you need to have better special effects.
I agree with Liz and Adam about the popcorn balls. Although I just would say that even though I thought the cuckoo clocks with the different Disney movies were like grossly indulgent, the animation quality and production values of those cuckoo clocks was amazing. And like the scene where Jiminy Cricket is like crawling over the cuckoo clocks, I was like, did they make a real model for this or did they model it in CGI? And I enjoyed that moment of being like, oh, this is so good that I can't tell. But when you put them together, it didn't. Yeah, there's still some work to be done in incorporating CG and real live action.
We'll get there someday, maybe. Thinking of taglines for the episode name, Liz. If you own the world, you should have better special effects. That we need to throw that one in there.
Oh, it should have just been you can buy anything in this world for money, but not good CGI effects.
I'm going to go with 1 on the Disney Plus. I don't feel it added anything. Several of us have used the term cash grab. It's just kind of there just to do nothing interesting artistically or dramatically with the themes or the characters. We didn't talk a lot about the puppeteer in the Disney Plus one. That's the new character that shows up and has an utterly forgettable song, who is a former ballerina whose leg is now broken. I feel like there's something they could have done with that character.
It feels like some pieces were there to do something interesting and they just didn't ever, like Rachel said, they didn't bring everything together and wrap it all up. It's like she shows up at the end and, hey, join our puppet troupe. Okay, bye.
And it's just, there was nothing there except that maybe if this is a box you need to check.
All the main characters are men.
The Del Toro version is like so masculine focused.
It is a father and son movie.
There's only so much you can do, but they tried to in the Disney Plus. I don't know. It just felt like maybe that was the reason they put her in there, but they could have done so much more, but it's not there. So anyway, 1 popcorn ball for me on the Disney Plus version and 5 for the Del Toro one. Beautifully dark. I'm going to stick with that. That's a great one-liner for the movie and most of Del Toro's work. I'm still angry that we never got his version of The Hobbit.
They're making new Lord of the Rings movies. You might get our wish.
Oh, let's not discuss that right now.
And our final rating system is Gospel Connections, morally edifying messages, 1 to 5 apricots. I'll go first this time. I feel like the Disney Plus version, like I did have some good conversations with my kids. Those elements are there. Talked about the Pleasure Island and how they turn into donkeys because they're doing bad things. And is that guy really trying to help them? And my daughter's like, no, he's trying to turn them into donkeys to send them to the salt mines.
Good stranger danger advice in this movie.
So I feel maybe not gospel connections, but you can have some conversations with kids about it. So I'd give it a 2 or a 3 maybe. But the Del Toro one, even the little subplots that happened, I feel like he had something to say in each one of them, and there were good things happening. Maybe not as explicitly gospel-based as The Chosen for our last episode, but there's a lot of stuff about he hasn't finished the crucifix for the church, and at one point Pinocchio is up on a stick with his arms out in a crucifixion position, and as he becomes a better person, he's clearly seen as a Christ figure to help save the monkey and the grasshopper and his father. And so I'm going to give that one 5 apricots, but I'm interested to see what other people have to say. Rachel, why don't we have you go first on this one? 1 to 5 apricots, morally edifying gospel connection messages.
I think I agree with you on the number of apricots. Disney Plus version, some basic moralizing you can do with fairy tales. The Del Toro, actually, I'm thinking about it, like, it depends on your audience too. I couldn't even get my daughter to look at this movie with me because she's so easily scared. She's 8 years old, but just like the vibe of the opening, she was like, nope. So maybe for me, it was Five Apricots because it made me think of my own religion in a different way. But for my daughter, it's not available.
True.
Adam, we'll have you go next, though, on Gospel Connections, Morally Edifying Messages. Where would you rate these two movies, 1 to 5 apricots?
I feel like the Disney one was like the Jefferson Bible, just some general moral theology there about don't lie to your neighbor, be good to your neighbor. Del Toro was definitely like the triple combination, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. I really loved, and I think Rachel pointed this out several times, the analysis of the human body versus the divine body and our connection as beings created in the image of God to Heavenly Father. And the movie touched on that in very subtle ways several times. And I thought that was the way it did it was really brilliant. Like the comparison, as Liz said, between the crucified Christ and the wooden Pinocchio, very profound, very deep, what I expect from Del Toro. 5 apricots.
And Liz, where do you put these?
Not a lot to add, all the same. Yeah, I'd put Disney 2, maybe even just 1. It's very confused in its moral messages. I feel like it's pretty heavy-handed, especially the parts that they added to Pleasure Island with the Rage Corner, which is apparently like social media or whatever, where we can just yell at people and smash cuckoo clocks. It's just like such an unsubtle critique compared to the social media critique we saw in Hated in the Nation in our previous episode. So it's just not well done in terms of moral messaging. It's confused. And Guillermo del Toro, 5, some great religious imagery. We had lots of interesting discussions about Mormon doctrine, which I don't expect to show up in films usually. And here it is. So not intentionally in any way, I'm sure, but I thought there were some really great jumping off points.
Yeah. He has good things to say about the human condition. And if you have a good discussion of that, you can jump off into lots of, I'm sure even Buddhists or Hindus or someone else could watch this movie and still have a good podcast about it. If there's a Hindu movie podcast out there, please someone send it to me so I can listen to their thoughts. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion of the 2 Pinocchio episodes here on Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree. I'm on Twitter at Carl Cranney if you'd like to reach out and have any thoughts about this episode. Liz, where can people find you on social media?
You can find my writing and book reviews at lizbusby.com, and my social media links are on there.
Awesome. And Rachel, where can people find you if they wanted to reach out?
I'm on Twitter at Rachel_helps. That's just spelled HELPS. And I tweet about weird things I find in my research and also sometimes video game stuff because I write interactive fiction.
Yeah, can you give us a pitch for one of your games?
Oh, sure. I recently wrote Admiration Point. It received 20th place in the interactive fiction competition last year. It's about a woman in the near future who's a married Mormon, and she has an unwanted crush on her coworker, and they work at, it's called a digital culture museum. And so it's my ideas about the future of galleries and museums when like a lot of our culture is consumed online.
Adam, where could people find you on social media?
Yeah, I have an Instagram page, Adam the Giant Guy 2019. I talk about science fiction, Mormon theology, ancient civilizations, giants, etc. I also have a Facebook page for my tutoring business, Lingua Classica, where I tutor in Latin, Greek, and a little bit of German. My German's kind of rusty, but my Latin and Greek are really good. And I post stuff about ancient civilizations, basically Rome and Greek culture on there. You guys can check that out.
Great. Thanks for joining us this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a like or review on the podcast platform of your choice and subscribe and follow us on social media so you can enjoy future episodes. Liz, why don't you tell us what is in store for our next episode?
Okay, our next episode is our anniversary of the launch of the podcast. We're going to be discussing Arrival, the 2016 film based on the short story Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. Denis Villeneuve won an Oscar for this fantastic look at first contact, language, and time. And a Mormon review of Arrival was kind of the impetus for creating this podcast. So I thought was appropriate to do for our first anniversary. So I'm excited to discuss this film.
Look forward to that. Thank you for joining us. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, and praiseworthy. See you next time.